are continuing our series on Moses in the desert with the Israelites. Remember, they are traveling from Egypt, where God liberated them and set them free, and they are traveling to the promised land. And right now, they are in the middle of the desert. They have settled around Mount Sinai, and Moses has been receiving the law from God. And last week, Pastor Melissa told us about when Moses was on the top of the mountain with God, receiving the covenant. The people of Israel were at the foot of Mount Sinai, completely breaking the covenant. So that is the setting for where we're starting this morning. And I wanted to show you a slide that has a picture of Jeff and I when we got married. This was in 2001, 22 years ago, this week. Thank you. We had a wedding cake topper made by Lennox Porcelain Company. There's a picture of what a whole one looks like on the left. And a few weeks ago, we have someone who comes in and cleans our house once a month, and she sent me the picture on the right, which was very sad. It was broken. It was totally in pieces, and she was very sorry about it, and I was sorry too, but I was also concerned about how she felt about it, so I was quick to say, it's totally fine. But Jeff and I had this conversation. What do we do now? This is something that we value. It's something that has meaning. Do we throw it out completely and try to buy a new one, or do we try to put the pieces back together? This is something that has sentimental value. What do you do when something you value gets broken? And the reason I show you this slide this morning is because God had created this relationship with Israel. It was deeply valuable. It was very, very important, and yet it had been broken. That's where we start this morning with our first point, broken relationship. And what hope can you have for a relationship when you know that you yourself are responsible for breaking it? Israel broke God's covenant promise before the ink was even dry on the contract. I mean, yes, there were tablets, they were etched, but you get the idea. Bible scholars compare this, and this is a very vivid image, to committing adultery during your wedding reception. That is the level of betrayal that the Israelites committed against the God who loved them and who had invited them into this relationship. Remember, I told you that this is sort of like a marriage contract. God said, I want Israel to be in relationship with me. I want to be their only God, and I want them to love me only and to take my name. That's what God asked of the Israelites. Meanwhile, they're at the base of the mountain worshiping other gods and celebrating that. So this is the nature of this breakdown in relationship. And now Moses is left in between these two parties that are broken, where their relationship is broken down. Moses is left standing in the middle between the Israelites and God. And God had a choice in this moment to either throw away the broken pieces of this relationship or try to restore it. And so that is the conversation that Moses is having with God. And God, let's face it, is angry. He's been betrayed. He has a right to be angry. And so God says to Moses, I'm going to just not continue this relationship with Israel. Instead, I'm going to turn you, Moses, into a great nation, and I'm going to move forward with you. So that's where we pick up this conversation between the two of them. Meanwhile, Moses is standing there intervening with God, reminding God the nature of these covenant promises God has made to Israel, and reminding God of God's character. So Moses says to God, think of your reputation. What will Egypt think if you get rid of this relationship with Israel? Everyone knows, all of the other nations know that you have chosen Israel to be your special people. So he asks God to turn from his anger, to relent, and to not bring disaster on the Israelites. Moses reaches back into history and reminds God, you have promised to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You have promised to be the God of Israel. That's who you are. So Moses says, I will go and make atonement for the people. This is what he tells the Israelites. I will try to make atonement for you. And he begins by acknowledging the reality of the brokenness and their sin. He doesn't ignore it. They had sinned against God. They did deserve to be blotted out. But Moses goes and asks God to forgive them. And Moses offers to take the punishment himself that Israel deserves. This morning, this is a bit of a side note, but for all of us, we are in relationships, and sometimes those relationships get broken. They do not get repaired when we ignore the problem. When the offense gets ignored, the offended person is made to absorb the hurt, rather than having the offender address, acknowledge, repent, and seek restoration for that hurt. Unless the hurt is openly addressed, the relationship might move forward, but there won't be true healing. And that is the situation that Israel finds itself in their relationship with God. They knew they had broken that relationship. Which brings me to the second point, the glory of God. So God's glory is this idea, it has to do with God's holiness, God's righteousness, and God's justice. And sometimes when we think of those ideas, it's a little scary to think about this perfect God who is altogether holy, altogether righteous, and altogether just. When we ignore injustice or allow unrighteousness to go unpunished, that runs contrary to the very nature of who God is. God had been wronged by the Israelites. This isn't something God could ignore. Because Israel had broken this covenant promise, God could not go forward with the people of Israel. And God says, my presence might kill you. Because God's glory cannot coexist with the sin of the people. So then in Exodus 33, this is a little bit before our text this morning, verses 1 through 6, God says to Moses, lead these people into the promised land. And God said, I will send an angel to lead you. But God himself said, I will not go with you because my presence might kill you. We've got this problem, this unresolved wrong that because there has been this offense and it has not been fully resolved, God could not go with the people. And so we're in this holding pattern while this problem is being negotiated and figured out. So God told all of the Israelites to remove their jewelry while he decides what to do with them. I'm not really sure why this is there, but I think it's an interesting little detail. And then in verses 7 through 11, Moses goes into the tent of meeting, which is where God's presence rests. And God and Moses have this conversation. Meanwhile, all of the people of Israel stand outside of their own tents and they worship and they pray. I think about like a child in timeout when they know they've done something wrong. You know how they kind of sometimes feel a little penitent, like they're sitting, in their timeout chair. We used to call it the penalty box. They're sitting there, they know they've done something wrong, and they're think about what you did. That's essentially what's happening with the Israelites. They're standing outside their tents, thinking about what they did, and they're waiting on Moses to meet with God, and everything is basically on pause while this conversation takes place. Okay. The questions that the Israelites are asking themselves are, what is God going to do? Is God really going to abandon his people, the people of Israel? But also, how could God, a holy, good God, go forward with the people of Israel when they have clearly violated their covenant promises to God? Which brings me now to our third point, the goodness of God. And this is from our text this morning, from chapter 33, verses 12 through 23. And I got to tell you, I kind of wish we could read this interpretively. I'm going to do my best here. But I want you to listen to the way that Moses negotiates with God. Moses says to God, you have said, lead these people, but you have not told me Who will go with me? Remember, the question is whether or not God's presence will go, or if an angel will go. And so Moses says, you have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your way so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. And then he says, remember, this nation is your people. So Moses is reminding God, Israel belongs to you. And God says, I love this, my presence will go with you, Moses, and I will give you, Moses, rest. And Moses responds, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? Do you notice this conversation? God keeps talking about Moses, and Moses says, yes, thanks God, but also, what about everybody else? And God says, I will do the very thing you have asked because I am pleased with you and because I know you by name. So God is pleased with Moses' intercession. But one of the questions that I have while I was reading this text this week is, what is it about this conversation in particular that pleased God? Here are my musings, but I'm going to make you talk about it too, so start thinking about it now. Moses understood the holiness and character of God. He knew that the Israelites had offended the very character and essence of God's goodness and holiness. So he knew that God could not contradict his character. And yet, Moses also knew that God's covenant with Israel still stood because of who God is, because God is the one who had made the promise in the first place. So this is why Moses kept saying the word remember. Remember, these are your people. Moses suspected that God could freely choose to display mercy, kindness, and compassion, even though God's holiness and righteousness and justice had been violated. This is what Moses is counting on in this moment, which should give all of us some hope. So Moses says to God, now show me your glory. And the word glory in the Hebrew can also be translated face. So Moses says to God, show me your face. Show me your glory as a way of confirming that you will actually go with us. And God says, I can't show you my glory, Moses, but I can show you my goodness. And he says, I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. So God says, I can't show you my glory. My glory would kill you, but I can show you my goodness, and I will proclaim my name to you. And this is what God says to describe his name. He says, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I choose to have compassion. But you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. So God is saying, I can choose mercy. I can choose compassion because that is my name. So then God places Moses in a little hole in a rock and puts his hand on top of him. God declares his own name, this mercy and compassionate God, and passes by Moses so that Moses can see God's back. Friends, this morning, there are some things about God that we are never going to understand. As much as I wish I could say, I'm going to tell you all the things. I can't tell you all the things because I don't know all the things and no one else does either. We cannot see God's glory. We can't see God's face fully and expect to survive. But we can experience God's goodness, his mercy, and his compassion. So this morning, I have two questions I want you to consider. Here they are. First of all, why do you think God chose to relent and repair this relationship with Israel? Remember, God was the offended party in this scenario. God did nothing wrong. The Israelites were the one that violated the covenant. So why did God choose to relent and choose to repair instead of toss out and start over? And the second question is, what role did Moses play in repairing this relationship? What was it about this conversation that Moses had with God in the tent of meeting that caused God to change his mind? So if you want to grab a Bible, that might help you, Exodus 33, 12 through 23. But go ahead and spend a few moments talking about this, and then I'll bring us back together and explain some more. So go ahead and chat amongst yourselves. This morning I started out by asking you, what do you do when you break something that has a lot of value? The question is, do you throw it out and start over, or do you try to repair it? And I showed you that picture of our wedding cake topper. There's another slide here. There you go. That is the one that we have in our house. Jeff got some super glue and glued it back together. We weren't able to save the little archway, but we decided we didn't really care about that. It was more important to have the original that was present on our wedding cake. So we were kind of excited about that. He was able to glue the bride's head back on. I was like, that feels sort of necessary. But if you look at it, you can see, if you look up close, you can see the lines of where the glue is gluing the broken pieces back together. This is just totally a side note, there is a Japanese art tradition where they take broken pottery and they glue it back together, and they mix in precious metals with the glue so that the seam where the pieces came back together will always be visible. And the idea is it becomes more valuable in its repaired state. When God was faced with a broken covenant relationship with Israel, he was the injured party. God was the one whose trust had been violated by the people of Israel. But in this scenario, God chose goodness, mercy, and compassion because that is who God is. That is who God chooses to be. That is God's name. So the Israelites had violated their promise to love God and to represent God's name to the world very early in their relationship with God. And friends, the reality is we break this promise too. God has asked us the same thing. Will you love me only? Will you represent my name? Will you take my name on yourself, call yourself a Christian, and live that way in the world? And friends, we break this promise. That's part of who we are. And broken promises always hurt relationships. We hurt our relationship with God as well. So when we break our promises to God, we violate God's holiness, God's righteousness, and God's justice. And God takes this seriously. This is part of who God is. What's different about this story is that Moses knew all of it. Moses knew the holiness, the righteousness, and the justice of God. He also knew the mercy, the compassion, and the kindness of God. And that's what he called upon in this moment. He reminded God, this is who you said you would be. And you said that you would take these people as your own. He knew that God can't contradict his character, but he also believed that God can freely choose to demonstrate mercy. When we break our promises to God, we also can ask God and depend upon God to show mercy towards us and to do the work of gluing the pieces back together and restoring that relationship with God. That's the work that only God can do on our behalf. That's why we celebrate the Lord's Supper every week, because we know that we are dependent on the blood of Christ to restore us into relationship with God. We know that we will break that relationship again and again. It's who we are. We're human, we're broken. We want to be made into the image of Christ. And we believe that God is doing that work over time, making us holy. But there is still repair work that needs to be done. So I love that image of God in heaven taking the little pieces and gluing them back together. That's what God is doing in our lives through Christ. And when we gather here together, we're admitting that we need that work done in our own lives. So I'm going to pray for us, and then Ethan's going to lead us in a song, and then we'll celebrate the Lord's Supper together.